Welcome to Recaps Movie. The series begins by showing a sergeant named David Budd who is on a train to take his two children, Charlie and Ella, to his wife Vicky's house in London, Euston. Currently, Vicky and David are living separately as they are planning to divorce due to their strained relationship after his return from Afghanistan, which left David experiencing unpredictable moods and issues with PTSD. During the train journey, David accidentally notices a suspicious man entering the train carriage that he is on. Initially, David does not pay much attention to it until he sees a train attendant approaching the man who is now in the toilet. David then becomes alert and asks a female passenger to watch his children because David intends to investigate what is really happening. David then approaches the train attendant and asks if there is anything threatening the safety of the passengers. After learning that he is a sergeant in the police force, the attendant says she received a report from British Transport Police about a terrorist planning to blow up the train. Given the unsafe situation, David asks the attendant to follow his instructions and requests the attendant's phone number so that he can contact her if he manages to catch the terrorist hiding on the train. David then goes to the toilet in one of the carriages that he suspects as the terrorist hiding place. Quickly, David calls the train attendant to open the train doors so they can evacuate the passengers in that carriage. After waiting for a while, a man comes out of the toilet who appears to be not suspicious at all, so David lets the man go. To ensure the train's safety, David goes to the toilet in another carriage. Meanwhile, the police, who have received reports of the terrorist threat, prepare at the next station stop. Upon reaching one of the toilets, David forcibly opens the door and finds a woman named Nadia Ali, who is terrified because a bomb vest has been strapped to her body. When she sees David, Nadia threatens to press the bomb detonation button if he tries to get closer. Seeing this, David tries to calm Nadia by saying that he is also scared while showing a photo of his two children who are now on the same train as them. Moments later, Nadia admits that she was forced by her husband to detonate the bomb on her body. Upon arriving at the next station, the police immediately entered and asked David to step aside, but he refused and chose to continue persuading Nadia not to detonate the bomb. With his persistence, David finally managed to bring Nadia out of the toilet to be secured so that the police could defuse the bomb on her body. Shortly thereafter, Nadia's husband was also captured, allowing the train journey to continue. Upon arriving at Vicky's house, David immediately took his two children to rest after the long journey. When Charlie and Ella had fallen asleep, David tried to talk to Vicky to discuss their marriage. Although he tried to reconcile, Vicky had already made up her mind to divorce. Disappointed with her decision, David apologized before he left the house. The next day, David appeared back at work at the police station and was called in by his superior, Lorraine Craddock, who had learned how David had thwarted the terrorism attempt on the train. Due to his accomplishment, Lorraine said that their commissioner requested David to provide protection for the Home Secretary and Conservative Party member of Parliament named Julia Montague. David gladly accepted the job, and after looking up Julia's profile on the internet, the next day, David began securing her activities. At that time, Julia appeared indifferent after learning that her personal bodyguard had been replaced. After Julia finished her meeting, David asked Terry, Julia's driver, to follow the route that he had planned for her safety. Hearing this, Julia disagreed and said that Terry had been working with her for 3 years, so Terry knew which routes to take to drive Julia. Hearing this, David then followed Julia's instructions. Upon arriving at Julia's residence, David again conducted a thorough inspection of each room to ensure that nothing would endanger her. Feeling annoyed by the security protocol, Julia asked David to finish his work quickly, citing that she would soon be receiving guests. While waiting for her guest to arrive, Julia read the file on David and realized that he was the person who had thwarted the terrorist attack on the train. Because of that, Julia apologized for being rude to David. Shortly thereafter, the special advisor to the Home Secretary named Rob MacDonald, who secretly has a crush on Julia, arrived to meet her. Seeing Julia talking with Rob, David decided to leave. On another day, David continued to provide security for Julia, who was going to attend an interview. While Julia was preparing her materials, her assistant named Chanel Dyson accidentally spilled coffee on Julia's clothes. Since the interview was about to start, David quickly offered his shirt and jacket for her to wear. The interview finally began, and Julia discussed terrorism and the RIPA 18 bill she championed, which included various regulations granting greater powers to the police and security services to investigate personal communications and information related to ongoing cases. The next day, when David just arrived at the office, he suddenly received a call to immediately provide security for Julia. Quickly, David rushed to the Home Secretary's office, where he saw Chanel throwing a fit after being fired by Julia. David then secured Chanel and asked her to leave the place. On another occasion, when David was driving Julia back to her home, she gave David a new jacket as a thank you for his help during the previous interview. Additionally, the gift was also an appreciation for his success in capturing alive the terrorist suspect who almost blew up the train, allowing the police to further investigate the terrorist group. Another day, when David was on his way to work, he deliberately stopped by Vicky's house to see his two children. Unfortunately, Charlie and Ella were staying over at their friend's house. At that moment, David again apologized to Vicky because he wanted to fix their marriage, but she refused and then confessed that she had been seeing another man. Hearing this, David tried to contain his anger and suggested that their divorce be postponed so that Vicky could receive his pension if anything happened to him. In a cafe, Chanel met with her friend, who is also a journalist, to provide some information related to Julia. It turned out, Chanel was still upset about how Julia treated her, began bad-mouthing her, claiming that she is a very dangerous politician. This, according to Chanel, is evidenced by Julia's agenda to seize power. Chanel's friend did not immediately believe everything she said, especially since Chanel had just been fired by Julia. That night, David met his old friend named Andy Apstead, who was giving a speech at a forum. After the event ended, they talked about their past lives where they both had been deployed to fight in Afghanistan. Due to the war, Andy's face became disfigured, while David lost his family because of the mental disorders he experienced after facing various traumatic events during the war. Andy then expressed his anger towards the country's leaders who sent them to Afghanistan. On another day, while David was dropping off his children at school, and after learning that Charlie was often bullied by his schoolmates, David advised his son not to show his weakness so that his friends would not tease him again. After ensuring his children arrived at school safely, David went back to work to escort Julia to a meeting with other state officials. On the way, he received a call from Vicky, who said that a teacher at the school reported they had given up on trying to control Charlie's naughty behavior. Hearing this, David promised to look for a special school for their children and asked Vicky to hang up as he was on duty. Upon arriving at the destination, Julia first had a meeting with Stephen Huntdon, the Director General of the Security Service. In the meeting, Stephen reported receiving information that a terrorist attack was planned on a school where David's children are enrolled. Stephen also believed that the terrorists had learned the secret of David's family and were planning revenge against him for thwarting their previous terrorist act. Despite the information involving David's family, Julia chose to keep this information confidential for the time being. Not long after, Julia and Stephen held a meeting with the country's top officials to discuss the captured bombing suspect. Unfortunately, the police have not yet found the motive behind the terrorist attack. The next day, the police sent their forces to David's children's school, which was suspected to be a target of the terrorists. At that time, 2 agents managed to tail the vehicle used by the suspects, but the terrorists then switched their car with a white truck. After conducting surveillance around the area, and Sampson, who was the head of the Metropolitan Police Counter-Terrorism Command, ordered her forces to stop the truck immediately. Thanks to the efforts of the police, the terrorist truck was stopped before it reached the school area. The police then approached the truck to check on the terrorists, who were believed to be dead. Unfortunately, one of the terrorists was still alive and managed to activate the bomb they were carrying. The explosion killed both terrorists and 3 police officers at the scene. Additionally, 5 people were injured due to the explosion. After receiving news of the bomb explosion, Julia immediately approached David to offer condolences for his colleagues who were victims of the bombing. Julia also informed David that the explosion site was near his children's school. Although there were no civilian casualties, she asked David to contact his wife to ensure their children's safety. That night, David met with Lorraine, who informed him that his family had been moved to a safe location. With the terrorist attack occurring near David's children's school, Lorraine suspected that David had become a target for the terrorists. Therefore, Lorraine decided to temporarily remove David from his duties for his and Julia's safety. After meeting with Lorraine, David immediately went to see his family, who were under tight police protection. At that time, David had a heated argument with Vicky regarding the terrorist incident near their children's school. The next day, Julia held a meeting with top government officials to discuss the bomb explosion near the school. She appeared to blame the police for failing to detect the terrorist attack earlier, which resulted in casualties among their own ranks. Although the police explained the situation, Julia, who had lost faith in the police's performance, ultimately appointed Stephen from the security service to take over the terrorism case. After the meeting, Mike Travis, the Minister of State for Counterterrorism, met with Julia and expressed concern that her decision to involve the security service in the terrorism case was a dangerous move. This was because the security service was considered to be less transparent and less competent in handling terrorist activities. Julia, however, dismissed his concerns, stating that she trusted Stephen to resolve the case. At the same time, Vicky and David were delighted to learn that their children had been enrolled in a new school with government assistance. Shortly after, David received a call from Lorraine to return to duty to protect Julia. That night, David escorted Julia to a restaurant for a dinner with her colleagues. Unexpectedly, besides Julia, only Rob showed up, explaining that their other colleagues couldn't make it due to other commitments. Feeling awkward about dining alone with Rob, Julia decided to leave the restaurant and chose to have dinner at home with David. After a lengthy conversation, Julia learned that David and Vicky had divorced. On another day, Julia attended another meeting to discuss the increasingly concerning issue of terrorism. After the meeting, David drove Julia to her home, but during the journey, they were suddenly attacked by gunfire from an unknown assailant targeting their car. At that moment, the gunfire struck Terry in the head, killing him instantly. David then tried to calm the panicked Julia and contacted his colleagues for help. Since help was delayed, David took the initiative to secure the situation by exiting the car to identify the source of the gunfire. Using his mobile phone, David managed to locate the shooter on top of a building. After removing Terry's body from the car, David quickly drove the car out of the shooter's range. When the situation seemed secure, David prepared his weapon to apprehend the shooter targeting Julia's car. Upon reaching the rooftop where the shooter was, David was shocked to discover that the shooter was Andy. David attempted to persuade him to surrender, but unfortunately, Andy chose to do the unthinkable. That night, Julia asked David to stay with her at home because she was still frightened by the incident that had happened earlier that day. After David arrived, Julia expressed her frustration towards the police for not deploying special forces to assist them. David seemed unable to respond as it wasn't within his authority, but rather Anne's. David then tried to calm Julia, but unfortunately, they both got carried away by the moment and ended up enjoying the night together. The next day, David was summoned by Lorraine, and in where the police officials praised him for his actions in saving Julia. On the other hand, and also questioned why Julia had stopped including her in various meetings related to national security, and then expressed her frustration with Julia's attitude, especially after she had handed over the terrorist case on the train to the security service. With all the irregularities found, and believed that Julia was a dangerous politician who needed to be removed. To execute this plan, and asked for David's help to monitor Julia's every move, including reporting who she was meeting with. Since Julia was reportedly going on an out-of-town visit, and informed David that they had booked a hotel room for him next to Julia's room. Sometime later, David arrived at the hotel to provide security during Julia's visit, and after checking his room, David discovered that it had a connecting door that led directly to Julia's room. Not long after David returned to his room, he heard Julia meeting with Stephen, prompting David to set up his listening device to eavesdrop on their conversation, which turned out to be about the RIPA 18 agenda. Moreover, Julia revealed that she had been set up by the police because her travel data had been leaked, including the material she was going to present at the forum. Stephen then reassured Julia to stay calm, saying that he would prepare new material without anyone knowing. After overhearing this conversation, David began to believe Anne's claim that Julia was a dangerous politician. On another occasion, after escorting Julia to a meeting, David was summoned by Lorraine, who asked for a report on Julia's secret meeting with Stephen. Although he had overheard all of Julia's conversation with her guest, David chose to remain silent and lied, saying that he didn't hear the conversation because he was in the bathroom. Despite this, David promised to record all of Julia's conversations with her other guests. Lorraine seemed to believe David's words and asked him to meet with the two detectives handling the case of Julia's shooting. Without wasting any time, David hurried to meet Inspector Deepak Sharma and Louise Rabin to conduct an interrogation regarding the shooting that happened to Julia. Upon arriving in the interrogation room, David explained everything that had happened to Julia. Louise then showed a photo from the building's surveillance camera footage that showed David meeting with the shooter, making her curious about what David had discussed with the shooter. David simply replied that the shooter did not want to surrender, so he was forced to kill him. After completing the interrogation, David returned to his hotel room where he saw news about the reconstruction of Andy's face as the shooter of Julia. The security forces then requested that anyone who had ever known Andy provide information about the shooter. Not long after, David noticed that Julia was having a meeting with a man, prompting him to immediately take his equipment to eavesdrop on her conversation. At that time, David heard the man giving a secret tablet to Julia so that her agenda would not be known by others. The man also mentioned that he would retrieve the tablet once Julia had finished using it. Curious about the guest meeting Julia, David intentionally left his room just as the guest was leaving Julia's room. As her bodyguard, David approached and asked for the man's identity, who in turn asked for David's identity first. After David provided his identification card, the man introduced himself as Richard Longcross. The next day, the police tried to trace Andy's movements from a surveillance camera recording that showed the shooter arriving at a building at night before the shooting occurred. Therefore, the police suspected that Andy had known Julia's travel route, allowing the shooter to position himself at the most strategic location to carry out his action. At the same time, David was trying to find out the full identity of Richard using the police database, but unfortunately, he could not find out who Richard really was. That night, David secretly sneaked into Julia's room to take the tablet given by Richard and investigate its contents. The next day, David reported to Anne and Lorraine about Richard who had given the tablet to Julia, but he kept secret what he had learned about the files on the tablet. Sometime later, David received a call from Julia asking him to take her to a certain place. When they arrived in front of the Prime Minister's residence, Julia reminded David to keep her meeting with the Prime Minister that night a secret. Meanwhile, Stephen, who had learned that Julia had just met with the Prime Minister, was angry because they felt manipulated by the politician. One night, David and Julia slept together again, and when Julia woke up, she found that David was not beside her. Because of this, she went to David's room, but suddenly David began to strangle her as his PDA flared up. Realizing this, David immediately released Julia, who was scared, and ran back to her room. David then regretted his actions and apologized to her, although afterward, Julia tried to keep her distance from him. A short while later, although still feeling awkward because of the previous incident, David continued to guard Julia, who was scheduled to speak at a university. While Julia was giving her speech, David asked the campus security to remove a few people causing disturbances in protest against the RIPA 18 law. Not long after, David left the room because he saw a suspicious man. When David approached him, the man introduced himself as Tahir, who claimed to be Julia's new assistant. Tahir then explained that there was a mistake in the materials for Julia's speech, so he planned to give new materials to Julia. David then checked the bag that Tahir was carrying before finally returning to the room. Not long afterward, David's colleague named Kim Knowles noticed something suspicious around Julia, so she quickly ran toward her, followed by David. Unexpectedly, a bomb suddenly exploded near the podium where Julia was giving her speech. As a result of the explosion, Tahir and Kim were killed instantly, while Julia suffered severe injuries and had to be rushed to the ICU. On the other hand, David sustained only minor injuries because he was quite far from the explosion. After the incident, the security service and the Home Secretary blamed David for failing to provide adequate protection. At that time, David also tried to explain the chronology of the explosion to Roger Penhaligon, Julia's ex-husband, who came to the hospital to check on her condition. Unfortunately, Mike asked David to leave the hospital immediately. Switching to Deepak, who was handling the explosion case and asking for information from David's colleague named Tom. At that time, Tom admitted seeing David meeting someone outside the room before the explosion occurred. Deepak then continued the investigation through CCTV footage, leading the police to suspect that the explosion originated from the bag carried by Tahir. The police then questioned those closest to Julia, including David. Louise then asked David to hand over his phone and allow the police to search his residence. After the search, Deepak and Louise asked David some questions related to the statement given by Tom. David then recounted his encounter with Tahir, who was trying to meet Julia to give her new speech materials. He also explained that he had checked the contents of the bag carried by Tahir, which only contained some documents for the speech. A little later, since his residence was still being searched by the police, David decided to go to Vicky's house, where he expressed his regret for failing to protect Julia. After Vicky went asleep, David secretly took the keys to her car and used her car to go to the hospital where Julia was being treated. The next day, senior officials held a meeting led by Mike because Julia had not regained consciousness after being a victim of the bomb explosion. Anne, who also attended the meeting, explained that the police had identified Tahir as the perpetrator of the bombing. The police had also detained several members of Tahir's family for questioning. Back to David, who is still at the hospital. At that moment, he saw Roger and Julia's mother being approached by several doctors who announced that Julia's life could not be saved. David, who heard this, looked devastated and decided to go home to his residence. The overwhelming sense of regret that David felt prevented him from thinking clearly, leading him to take a gun hidden in the ceiling and shoot himself in the head. At the police station, Louise reported to Deepak that they had found CCTV footage showing a meeting between Tahir and Rob before the explosion occurred. In the footage, where Rob handed over a briefcase suspected to contain the bomb to Tahir. After viewing this, Deepak reported the findings to Anne. Meanwhile, Vicky, who was worried about David's condition, decided to look for him at his residence. After knocking on his door several times, David, who had survived his attempt to do the unthinkable, finally opened the door and invited Vicky in. Though he survived because his gun only had blank bullets, David sustained a minor injury on his head from bullet fragments. Knowing this, Vicky tended to David's wound and planned to take him to the hospital, but he refused. Concerned about David's condition, Vicky decided to bring him to her home. The next day, while staying with Vicky, David shared his suspicion that someone might have entered his house and replaced the bullets in his gun. Meanwhile, Rob, accompanied by his lawyer, was being interrogated by Deepak and Louise. Rob then claimed that on the day of the incident, he only handed over a briefcase containing Julia's speech materials to Tahir. Rob also mentioned that the briefcase originally belonged to Tahir, who had previously entrusted it to him. Regarding the phone call before the incident, Rob explained that he had only wanted to ensure everything was all right. Back to David, who decided to investigate the bombing case on his own. David is seen visiting the hotel where he and Julia were staying to check the hotel's CCTV footage. Strangely, the CCTV footage that should have shown Richard had been deleted, even though the hotel staff claimed that no one else had accessed the recordings. On the other hand, Deepak and Louise reported that they had found strong evidence of Rob's involvement in the explosion. After hearing this report, and thought that the explosion was related to the terrorist attack on the train, and asked Louise to get a statement from Nadia. To ensure the interview went smoothly, and suggested that Louise bring David during the interrogation with Nadia. Louise then picked up David, and on the way, she asked about the wound on his head, but David explained that the injury was caused by the stove at his house. During the interview, David began asking several questions regarding the bomb that Nadia's husband had obtained, and she informed them that her husband got the bomb from a man he met in a parking lot. David and Louise then showed her several photos of men who might be recognized by Nadia, but unfortunately, out of all the photos shown, Nadia did not recognize anyone among them. After the interview session was over, David suggested to Louise that they check the CCTV footage in the parking lot where Nadia's husband met the mentioned man. David also mentioned his suspicion about a man named Richard who had met Julia at the hotel, but unfortunately, he could not find the CCTV footage of Richard coming to the hotel. David then expressed his suspicion that the security service had deleted part of the CCTV footage. That night, Deepak and Louise reported the latest developments in the bombing case that killed Julia, and from the investigation carried out, it turned out that the explosion did not come from the briefcase brought by Tahir, but from under the stage where Julia was giving her speech. Therefore, Deepak suspected that the bomb was remotely controlled. Shortly afterward, Louise called David and said that he was not found guilty in the bombing case that killed Julia because the bomb did not come from the briefcase carried by Tahir. The next day, Louise checked the surveillance camera footage at the hotel where Julia was staying. As David had said, some parts of the surveillance footage had been cut so that the police could not trace the person who claimed to be Richard. Louise, who did not want to give up, then called David to help her team in reconstructing Richard's face, whose real name could not yet be identified. Meanwhile, the investigators managed to identify the face of the shooter who targeted Julia and discovered his identity details. From the data obtained, the police finally learned that the shooter was Andy, a former soldier who had served in Afghanistan as a bomb disposal expert. With that expertise, Louise suspected that Andy was part of Richard's group. David and Louise then showed Nadia a recording of someone giving the bomb to her husband. In addition, David also showed a sketch of Richard's face, even though Louise had initially objected. Unexpectedly, Nadia identified Richard as the person her husband had met. After reporting this to Deepak, David requested that the police immediately arrest Richard. Deepak, however, asked David to stay quiet, as only and had the authority to issue an arrest warrant. That night, David went to an internet cafe to find out more about Richard and various information related to the contents of the tablet given to Julia. Shortly after David left the place, he saw Richard and his associates entering the internet cafe, prompting David to quickly note down the vehicle number that Richard was driving. The next day, David, who was at the office, tried to trace Richard's vehicle number, but his efforts failed because the vehicle number search had been blocked by the security service. A few moments later, David was approached by Lorraine, who claimed to have received a report from Deepak about David acting outside the rules in the investigation of Julia's bombing case. Therefore, Lorraine invited David to meet with Anne. At that moment, David revealed the data he had found while searching at the internet cafe, and also expressed his suspicion that Richard was most likely part of the security service. In addition, David informed his superior that Richard was trying to prevent everyone from searching for a tablet that had been given to Julia, because the tablet contained various scandalous files related to the Prime Minister. David suspected that the security service did not want the contents of the tablet to be leaked. In his analysis, David suspected that the Prime Minister, Mike, Stephen, and Roger were connected to each other in the bombing case involving Julia. David then went to the hospital where Julia was being treated to ask what Roger had been doing when he visited Julia. The nurse whom David spoke with explained that Roger was merely concerned for his ex-wife's safety. The nurse also mentioned that Roger seemed to be looking for something that belonged to Julia. With that information, David then confronted Roger and brought up the tablet that had been given to Julia, prompting Roger to ask David to leave immediately. Following that encounter, Roger went to see Mike and told him about David visiting him. Roger suspected that David was also looking for the whereabouts of the tablet. Hearing this, Mike was puzzled as to how David could have known about the tablet, but he reassured Roger to stay calm as he would take care of the matter. On another day, David forced Rob, who was on his way to work, to explain what really happened during the bombing at Julia's seminar. With David's persistence, Rob finally admitted that he, Mike, and Roger had planned to embarrass Julia by inserting random material into her speech. However, Rob claimed to have no knowledge about the bomb that killed Julia. Due to David's involvement in uncovering the bombing case of Julia, the Prime Minister ordered his subordinates to remove David from the investigation related to Julia's death. On another day, Lorraine summoned David and asked him about his relationship with Julia. David was puzzled as to how Lorraine could have known about it, but she did not answer and instead asked David not to get too involved in the police investigation of Julia's bombing case. Upon leaving Lorraine's office, David encountered Vicky, who had come to his office. At that moment, he admitted that he had been having an affair with Julia, but Vicky did not react to that and instead informed David that a man claiming to be a police detective had asked about him earlier. David suspected that the man was Richard, so he immediately showed Vicky a sketch of Richard's face for confirmation. Vicky then confirmed that the detective who had met her earlier was indeed the man shown in David's sketch. Wasting no time, David immediately went to see Louise about Richard investigating him. On another day, while David was at a cafe, he accidentally met Chanel, who expressed her condolences for Julia's death. She also thanked David for helping her when Chanel was fired by Julia. Before leaving, Chanel exchanged phone numbers with David and planned to meet on another occasion. As Chanel left, David deliberately took a photo of the man who always accompanied Chanel and reported it to Louise. After investigation, it was found that the man was Luke Akins, the head of an organized crime company. Not long after, David was called by Lorraine, who had received information that he had attempted to do the unthinkable. Concerned about David's mental state, Lorraine suggested that he undergo counseling and also suspended him from his duties, including revoking his firearm license. That night, David went to Julia's residence where he managed to find the tablet that she had hidden behind a photo. Meanwhile, and met with Deepak to ask for an update on the investigation into the bombing that killed Julia. Deepak said that his team was investigating Luke, who was suspected of being involved in the case, and then asked where Deepak got the information about Luke. When Deepak admitted that he got it from David and asked him not to jump to conclusions. Afterwards, Deepak and Louise discuss Luke, who was suspected of bribing a senior officer, making it difficult for the police to uncover the murder case of Julia. Meanwhile, Chanel invited David to meet at a bar to chat privately in a room. Not long after, Luke and his henchmen arrived and beat David until he was unconscious. At the police station, Louise finally found out that Andy had been assigned to the same unit as David when they were on duty in Afghanistan. Louise then immediately informed Deepak about this and expressed her suspicion that David might have been collaborating with the killers. Hearing this, Deepak quickly issued an arrest warrant for David. Meanwhile, David, who had just regained consciousness, found that a bomb had been strapped to him, similar to the bomb placed on Nadia. Back to Louise, the detective was meeting with Vicky to find out about the relationship between David and Andy, but she claimed not to know anything about it. Louise then asked Vicky to come to the police station because there were some questions that the police needed to ask. On the other hand, David managed to get out, covering his body with a cloth and then asking a passing civilian to call the police. When the police arrived, David removed the cloth covering his body, revealing that a bomb had been strapped to him. Knowing this, Lorraine then instructed David to walk to a nearby park. After receiving a communication device from Louise, David claimed that he had been framed by Chanel and Luke, but she did not immediately believe David's statement, especially since he had hidden his friendship with Andy. David then explained that he had kept his relationship with Andy a secret to find out who was truly responsible for Julia's murder. David even swore that he was not involved in the shooting or the explosion that killed Julia. Meanwhile, Stephen monitored what was happening to David through surveillance cameras around the park. Back at the park, David continued to insist to the police that he was innocent, revealing that Luke had come to his house and swapped the bullets in his pistol. Vicky, who was also present at the scene, confirmed what David was saying. She even described how David almost did the unthinkable because he felt guilty for not being able to protect Julia. Unfortunately, the police still did not believe him, so David urged the police to retrieve the pistol from his house. Stephen, who was aware of this, immediately ordered Richard to go to David's house and destroy the evidence of the pistol. When Richard arrived at David's house, he fell into a trap that David had set, allowing the arriving police to arrest him at the house. At the park, as the bomb squad prepared to defuse the bomb strapped to David's body, and at her office, ordered all the police officers to withdraw. At the same time, Vicky suddenly ran towards David after hearing the order to shoot him. In the ensuing panic, the police canceled the shooting order. David then declared that he had evidence that could implicate the Prime Minister and his accomplices in the death of Julia. At the office, and attended a meeting regarding the ongoing incident involving David. She was visibly shocked when she saw that Mike had included Stephen in the meeting. During the meeting, and informed everyone that the police had arrested Richard, who was suspected of being a security service employee involved in Julia's death. Stephen denied this accusation and stated that the police did not have the authority to arrest Richard. Stephen even demanded that and release Richard immediately. Switching to David, who had arrived at his house with Vicky and the police force, David asked Vicky to dig around the house until she found a bag containing bullet casings and the tablet that Richard had given to Julia. David also requested that the police identify the fingerprints on the bullet casings to find out who had swapped the bullets in his house. With the evidence provided to the police, the bomb disposal unit sent a robot to help David remove the bomb from his body using the tools provided. When David successfully cut the last wire, he suddenly ran away and managed to escape the police surveillance. This made Stephen angry because he had lost track of David. That night, David met Chanel and forced her to reveal Luke's whereabouts. After finding Luke and following him, David was shocked to see Luke meeting with Lorraine, which made David realize that his boss was the one who had betrayed him. In his rage, David attacked Luke and his men and then pointed a gun at Luke, demanding that he confess to all his actions. Luke claimed that he killed Julia only because of business matters. A few days later, while David was observing Lorraine's interrogation, he received news from Louise that the fingerprints on the empty bullet belonged to Luke. Louise also apologized for having misjudged David. Meanwhile, Lorraine finally admitted that she had leaked Julia's travel details to Luke, who planned to kill her after learning that Julia had transferred authority to the security service to handle the terrorism case. Luke feared that the transfer of power would give the security service an advantage over organized crime groups like them and could hinder his criminal activities. Lorraine also mentioned that appointing David as Julia's bodyguard was part of Luke's plan to make him a scapegoat for what had happened. On another occasion, the police interrogated Nadia, who turned out to be the bomb maker and did not know Richard at all. Nadia also admitted to leaking information about David's family, which made them a target of terrorism. After all the cases were revealed, David saw the news about the Prime Minister's resignation and several high-ranking officials who had tried to bring down Julia, even though they were not proven to be involved in the terror that killed her, and thanked David for successfully uncovering the case of Julia's murder at that time, and informed him that the police had identified Nadia, Luke, and Lorraine as suspects in Julia's death. At the end of the series, it shows David starting counseling for his mental health issues. Sometime later, David, who had recovered, appeared much happier and went to Vicky's house to invite her and their children for a vacation together. Thank you for watching. To see more videos like this and help our community grow, subscribe, like and drop a comment. See you in another video. Bye.